So on that note, it's my pleasure to introduce our next presenter, Dr. Aditi Vijay. Dr. Aditi Vijay is an assistant professor at Keene University, where she directs the interpersonal context of emotion dysregulation lab, or the ICE lab. The ICE lab focuses on the transactional relationship between the interpersonal and social context, as well as emotion dysregulation. Her research and clinical interests are focused on emotion dysregulation processes that maintain adverse outcomes of chronic suicidality, self-harm, trauma, and rejection sensitivity, process and outcomes of dialectical behavior therapy, and anti-racism in clinical care. Her current projects include loneliness and emotion regulation in emerging adults, relationship between emotion regulation and trauma symptoms, the role of DBT consultation teams as predictors of DBT therapist burnout and adherence. Dr. Vijay also founded a small private practice specializing in dialectical behavior therapy and trauma treatment in New York City. Please welcome Dr. Aditi Vijay.
Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to be here with you today. Can you hear me? That's good. Okay. Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the stigma or the self-stigma of loneliness. I've been a clinician and a researcher. I don't want to actually count for how long, but for a long time. And over the last 7 years or so, I started to notice that the students, the residents, and the clients that I was working with, more and more were talking about these feelings of connection and their relationships being unsatisfying. I'll just note this was pre-COVID. So symptoms were improving, my graphs looked beautiful, and they were not consistent with my clients' life experiences. And this led me to start to wonder a little bit about what were some of these other variables and what did they mean? What did they mean for their lives? What do they mean for treatment? And that's how I started to delve into some concepts around loneliness. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about what it actually is. It seems like it shouldn't be that complicated a question, but in diving into a lot of this research, people have some different ideas. Loneliness can be a risk factor for many other kind of negative outcomes, and it can be a consequence of many different life events. So I want to talk a little bit about that and try to trace some of these pathways from loneliness and shame to stigma or self-stigma is kind of what I'm arguing here today. Loneliness and BPD, what does it look like specifically within this population that has really heterogeneous symptoms? And then what is the pathway to loneliness in BPD? And then we're going to talk a little bit about stigma more directly, and then wrap up with nurturing connections. Where do we go from here? And a little bit of a spoiler alert, I don't have a great answer for you there, but I'm hoping it's something we can kind of work on together. So I'm going to start with this idea that as humans, we have this fundamental need to belong. It's been documented like quite far back. And the idea of belonging is that we have this feeling of deep connection that we can be connected to groups, we can be connected to individuals, we can be connected to communities, or even collective experiences. But we as humans need that in order to survive and to thrive. When that need is thwarted, it can just begin with us feeling a little bit bad, a little bit lonely, a little out of sorts. But if this need to belong is really blocked for a person, this is actually how we get to things like in-group and out-group processes, prejudice, and discrimination. It's a really powerful need that we all have. And it's not something that we talk about very often, not even in clinical work, not in clinical training, not with our clients. What I'm finding is that it's quite rare for people to directly address this. I think partially because we don't have a lot of solutions to offer. So separate from belonging, what is loneliness? So there's lots of different ways in which people conceptualize this and research it and address it. The most widely accepted definition of loneliness is the one that I have here on the slide. And most of the research that I'll be referencing, this is how they are conceptualizing it. They're looking at it as a very painful feeling when the quantity and quality of one's social relationships are perceived as deficient. So you either don't have the number of relationships that you want, or the relationships that you have don't feel meaningful to you. It can be fleeting. I can feel lonely on a Friday night because I really want to go to a movie and there's no one there who wants to do it with me. Or I can go out with a group of people. I can be with my family. I can be with my partner and still feel really lonely because the quality of the connection doesn't feel good to me. As you can imagine, as many of these psychology talks start, this has negative implications for us in the realm of physical health, mental health. Generally, we don't want to live a life of persistent loneliness. Loneliness is a uniquely different experience from social isolation, which when I started looking into some of these concepts in 2017, social isolation was an amorphous concept. I no longer need to define that when talking about loneliness. It's different from being alone, which is a choice. I might decide that at the end of the day, I want to go home and sit on my couch and only the dog is allowed in, no humans. But that's my choice, and I'm unlikely to feel lonely in that context. And then there's solitude, which is considered to be a more joyous kind of spending time alone. It's something that people opt into and can often feel quite energizing. I'm kind of outlining these things because we're going to try really hard not to conflate them and really just try to focus on this painful experience of a lack of desired relationships. And then there are different types of loneliness. Emotional loneliness is what we are generally talking about when we use the word lonely, particularly in the context of DBT and psychology and friendships. There's a different kind of social loneliness when there are not people accessible to you to do things that you want to do. It can be having a chat. It can be going out to dinner. It can be going for a hike. But sometimes, based on a variety of factors, that just might not be a possibility. And then the other piece is this idea of a more existential loneliness. It's a feeling of a very fundamental separateness where a person just feels like they're quite different from their world and from the wider world. You can imagine, I'm sure, a situation where somebody feels maybe they don't belong in their family. They feel lonely in their family. This is even more intense than that and seems to be something that we are seeing in a lot of folks, I would say, like Gen Z and below. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of those hypotheses, but as to why that is. And this feeling of existential loneliness also seems to be related to a very different quality of loneliness in people who have BPD symptoms or related challenges. So if you can think about like a big circle, we have about 5 different buckets, and these different types of loneliness, these different types of experiences, we can all feel them. It's the duration, the frequency, and the intensity of it that then starts to impact our broader life. And this broader experience of loneliness is impacting people the world over. It's a universal experience. The World Health Organization conducted a study in 2023. So most of the numbers that I have up here were collected in 2022. So I'm not really clear. I couldn't share with you the impact of COVID. But about 25 to 50% of the world population endorsed significant feelings of loneliness. And there was still a substantial chunk who endorsed moderate feelings of loneliness. Pre-COVID, loneliness had already begun to be identified as a significant factor in mental health. So in 2017, the UK appointed a minister of loneliness. They felt that they were seeing levels of loneliness in young adult populations at frequencies, at percentages that had not been seen before. And what they did was put this person into office, and they have put together a public service campaign trying to help people identify how they can notice when they're feeling lonely, but then also how to figure out what do they do to increase feelings of connection in those moments. In 2014, I'm going backwards here, Vivek Murthy was the Surgeon General in 2014 and was the Surgeon General again in 2017. And he embarked on a listening tour to try to hear more from private citizens about what was happening for them in their medical health. He was interested in some of these larger physical health issues like cardiovascular health, obesity, and was looking to see what kinds of really practical solutions could he offer, what kind of policies needed to be implemented, that sort of thing. And what he came away with was that people are actually really lonely. And if we don't find a way to help people form connections that feel good to them, that felt like that was actually a big driver of physical health problems. And he released a report in 2017 saying that persistent feelings of loneliness, they don't define what persistent is, but we would say feeling lonely for weeks or months without a break is the equivalent of 14 cigarettes a day. So overall, all of the data are showing that something is happening in our community, and we want to try to think about how can we approach this. The numbers in the US are slightly higher, mostly in line with about 52% of Americans reporting feeling lonely. More interestingly, at least to me, were the 47% reporting that their relationships didn't feel meaningful. And this was sort of mirrored by what I was seeing clinically, where kids would say, I don't know what I want. I went out with my friend and it didn't feel good. I did everything that you told me. I did that stupid half smile. I breathed. I did everything, and it just wasn't fun. So that then is actually consistent with feelings of loneliness peaking in adolescence and then kind of plateauing and peaking again in older adulthood. These numbers around loneliness in adolescence are actually relatively recent. So for many years, a lot of this research has really focused on elder adults, and we're now starting to move into this area of thinking about, what does this look like for the more general population? So we're going to try a little bit of a practice here. I'm going to ask you to get into your mindfulness stance, whatever that is for you, just kind of sitting comfortably. You can close your eyes if you want to. You can fix your eyes on a point where you just won't be distracted. And what I want you to do is to just take a second, check in with yourself, notice what's coming up for you in your body. Now, I'd like you to just think of a time where you felt lonely. What was happening with you? What was going on in your life? And what was going on in your community? I'd like you to just picture this and notice what comes up for you in this moment. Now I'd like you to shift your attention slightly. And if you can think about maybe something that you've permanently borrowed from somebody else, something someone has given to you, or if that's not sparking any thoughts, even pulling out your phone and looking at a picture of someone you know. And for a few moments, I want you to just do the same thing as you are looking or thinking and picturing this object. What do you notice for yourself? Okay. I'm going to ask you to come back to the room, and I'm wondering if we have any volunteers that are willing to share what they noticed for the first one or the second one or the comparison. Yes.
The first one made me feel scared, and the second one made me feel calm.
Okay. I saw a hand back there. Yeah.
Heaviness versus lightness in my chest.
Okay. Thank you very much. I wish I had candy to throw at you both. Thank you so much. The idea is that this is a very quick demonstration of sort of the dialectics of loneliness, that on one hand, we have those feelings, the heaviness, when you think about being lonely, when you are hopefully experiencing a little bit of that. And on the other hand, it's not being alone, but it's about having a sense of connection, even if that person isn't here, or isn't even thinking about you in that exact moment. You're still able to kind of call up that sense of connection. And it's actually one of the exercises that we ask some of our clients to do at night when sometimes the loneliness can really hit. What are other ways in which you can increase a sense of connection, just as a start? So what are risk factors for loneliness? These factors that I have listed up on the left side are factors that are universally put us at risk for loneliness, depending on where we are. So, if you're a woman at a particular time in your life, where if you are a caregiver for a child, for somebody elderly, that can be a time where you might feel really lonely because it's at the cost of something else you might want to be doing. For a man, sorry, the research is really this gendered. When you retire and lose something, that if it's not replaced, we can see loneliness spiking at that point in time. Physical functioning, mental health, participation in society or in the community, and then the actual social relationships that you have, depending on where your life is in all of these categories, you may be more or less at risk for feeling lonely. These risk factors change across the lifespan. So in early adulthood and adolescence, when people feel like they are out of sync, either where they think they're supposed to be, or if they're out of sync with their peers, we see self-reported rates of loneliness go up. Somewhat similar in middle adulthood, if you don't go the path of getting married and having kids and finding a job, and in the US, I guess, buying a house, those sorts of things can really impact your feeling of loneliness. But you might notice a little bit of a difference where in early adulthood, the quantity of social relationships was important. Do you have a group? In middle adulthood, quality starts to become more important. Do you have somebody that you can call and you feel like they understand what you're sharing with them? And late adulthood, which is the most widely studied, gender, women tend to be more lonely in elderly life, largely as an interaction with their caregiving roles, and whether, especially their informal caregiving roles. If you're married, they think you're less lonely. Income and education level, do you have the resources to take care of yourself and do fun things when you want to? And one of the most robust predictors of loneliness in late adulthood is a local support network. So maybe you have great friends, an active social life, and you move when you retire and all of that goes away and you have to rebuild. So there's some movement. I think it's somewhat encouraging that there are aspects of this that we can actually help people to change. And it's important for us to be aware of what this can look like for folks. So loneliness as a consequence really comes as a consequence when those risk factors on that previous slide interact with life events. And when a person, let's say, has a lot of physical health limitations, which means it's harder for them to get out and socialize, like they have to call a restaurant to find out if a walker can go up the ramp. How steep is the ramp? That is likely then to interact with, like, do you live in a place where there are people available to you? Do you live in a place where you can easily get to where you're going to engage socially at like a community center or a church group? And so when and how somebody becomes lonely is very different from person to person because of these varying factors. And these factors can change from day to day. You might have, let's say you have migraines or severe vertigo and you can't drive. Today, that might feel really terrible and you have to cancel all your plans, but tomorrow that changes and you can go out and see some friends. So what we're also looking at is a very variable experience. I think that further complicates thinking about ways to help. There are other aspects of this simply stage of life. If you move for grad school, say, or you move for a job, or you move because your partner got a job and you're going somewhere you've never been, loneliness is something that we might expect you'll experience for a period of time. And then we have something like our handy cope ahead that could actually help to put some plans into place and to normalize that experience. The last piece here around social dynamics and environmental stress, I don't think I'm overstating it to say that we're living in a time and a space right now that feels pretty chaotic to many people. And a lot of what's going on around us socially, politically, people have strong feelings about. And if you are not able to connect with others who you can express that to and who can validate what you're feeling, I think that's when we start to creep towards this feeling of existential loneliness and feeling like there's really no one else like you on the planet. So I'm going to flip over here a little bit. And this is where this presentation becomes a little bit like a spider web because all of these different things are so closely related. It's hard to pick one and go in a linear fashion. So I'm going to start just by talking about this close relationship between loneliness and shame. There's a perception out there that if you are a lonely person or you describe yourself as being lonely, there is a perception that people can see that and that they stigmatize it. There was a study that was done in the early 90s, which actually seems to be like 0.0, that this study had some results that kind of lead to us thinking that lonely people are stigmatized, but it actually has not been replicated or substantiated. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. But what we really see when looking at qualitative interviews and asking people to talk about their social relationships, their feelings of loneliness, what we see are people saying, "What is wrong with me? What did I do? I'm broken. No one wants to be friends with me." And that is where those first feelings of shame emerge. It can be something like, I've made all these overtures to this group of girls in my college class, and they never respond. Something has to be wrong with me. And what we know, right, from family connections is that when we start to experience those feelings of shame, we have an urge to hide and to isolate. And if we do that over a long enough period of time, we start to kind of go down this pathway to judgments that increases our shame, and eventually we land in a place where we're stigmatizing loneliness. Maybe not just in ourselves, maybe in other people as well. But it seems like if we could back it up and maybe do a little bit more accurate expression, validation, and self-soothing, we could actually shift this pathway. The inaccurate expression is, I think, something that I can't understate here. The number of people in a lot of these studies who say, "I just didn't want to tell anybody, so I said that I was fine," and how that leads to people thinking that they are actually fine, and it doesn't occur to them, to act in different ways. There's also, I think, important to note here, this idea of, I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but people will talk about maybe at earlier ages, things like, well, I would never go to a movie by myself. I would never go to a restaurant by myself. But when you think about how often you go into a space like that and you see someone by themselves and you don't actually think about it twice, I think that's a lot of the dynamic that we're referring to here. So more specifically, how do we get from loneliness to self-stigma? I've outlined just a few pathways here, but I think this is actually pretty infinite. And for each person, this could look a little bit different. When someone's lonely, right, there are so many things that you don't want to experience, like rejection, like feeling abandoned. We think in that moment that the worst thing in the world would be to ask someone to do something and have them say no, which could then reinforce all these things that are already being thought of. And so isolation feels like a very natural extension of how this person is already feeling. And if that goes on for long enough, then that person starts to make these global judgments about themselves and their ability to interact with other people. Over time, right, those feelings of shame just get bigger and bigger and bigger, and we hide more and more and more. And it can also then start to impact when you actually do interact with somebody else. How do you handle that interaction? So I am borrowing a story from a consultation team with permission from the client and the clinician. But this woman was in her mid-20s, like truly lovely. I would have gone out and been friends with her if I had not met her through in this context. Just really, really nice. And I would think would be appealing to most people. So the ways in which she saw herself was very different to my experience of her as a skills group leader. We did a lot of work on skills, trying to help her figure out how to create more spaces to meet people. There was somebody in her building. They had said hi a couple times. They were around the same age, chatted a little bit. They ran into each other in the laundry room, and it was a good conversation. So she said, hey, like our clothes are both in the dry cycle. Do you want to just get a cup of coffee? So she's like, oh yeah, that works for me. Let's go. So they went, had a great time. And she describes that as the experience was starting to end, or she knew it was going to come to a close, the desperation kind of just welled up in her. So she's like, hey, do you want to go out to lunch? And so the person said, oh yeah, sure. I would love to. How about next week? And she was like, no, how about now? And it was just that desperation that was kind of driving her to try to continue this interaction that felt so good. But the unintended consequence in not taking no for an answer was that this person started to distance. And I think this is a good example of what happens in so many different ways when you feel lonely and something good comes your way. Also, that idea of trying to hold on to it for as long as you can then result in acting in ways that are not getting you closer to your goals. And that kind of then filters into like symptoms of borderline personality disorder, the fears of abandonment, the feelings of emptiness, and how kind of together those can also influence the interactions that folks have. There is the stigma that is just built into the disorder. We're talking about the disorder. And I think if you can picture it like pinballs, all just bumping into each other, making it very difficult to then go out and interact in a way that you would actually like to. And I guess more specifically, developing social relationships that feel good for you and that you can nurture and are long lasting. So I'm going to switch here to talk more specifically about the experience of loneliness in BPD. So it's interesting that so many theories about the development and maintenance of borderline personality disorder have interpersonal functioning at the core. And yet we really don't have that much research around what social relationships and social networks look like. So here I'm going to summarize what we do know. we do know that just symptoms associated with personality disorders can increase the risk of disconnection, right? Like, I think that we can accept. But what we find is that people with BPD specifically, so in studies of people who have that diagnosis, they were more intensely impacted by negative interpersonal events, social stressors, and negative social feedback. And that that kind of impact was then directly affecting the quality and the quantity of social relationships. So people with BPD were saying the relationship was great until it wasn't, and I couldn't figure out what had happened. This becomes actually a very important clinical target for clinicians, that it's not just about like dear man or interpersonal effectiveness skills to think about how we improve interactions, but also thinking about what kind of social network does this person actually want? Even like if I hear about, well, I'm an introvert, I don't need this one more time clinically. I'm like, we all need it in some way. What does your way look like for you? What we found was that in networks of like social networks of people with BPD, they tended to be smaller and they had a significantly higher number of romantic partners or former romantic partners in them, which kind of introduced a piece of volatility that made it harder to nurture those relationships, kind of begging the question, how much of this is about the person themselves versus the composition of the group, and kind of having a bit of a hurdle right out of the gate. There were also some interesting findings around how people with BPD compared to people who held other mental health diagnoses or psychological disorders, how they actually interacted with their social network. And in these studies, what was found was that folks with BPD actually rated pretty like satisfactory relationships, but when they felt upset, they did not reach out to their networks for help. So they were actually providing a lot of support and they weren't getting it back. So they weren't really getting the good parts of being in a friendship. And so you could see how over time that would overall impact how you feel about your friends and just getting out of your house and socializing. And then lastly, that's the last finding, that females with BPD perceive people in their network to be less positive and less supportive. And it was just a slightly more complex interaction. So that kind of sets us up for, this is the results of a meta-synthesis. Somebody spoke about a meta-analysis earlier today, and this is actually taking a number, I think it was 39 qualitative studies that looked at social relationships and connection in people with personality disorders, like all personality disorders. They then looked at all of the themes that had emerged from these various findings and then crystallized it into these. These were the major themes that emerged specifically for people with diagnoses of BPD. And what the idea was like, how do we, like, we feel from what we see that there's something different going on here. When we look at it in terms of number, like how many friends do you have and how satisfied do you feel, we're not really getting enough information to be helpful. So what we've got here is that people are describing that they're feeling something more akin to this existential loneliness. And that the quote that I included up here, just a haunting alienation, that even if they were connected to somebody, they might not know it. And they would like one of the participants in one of these studies said, I would love to know, like, if somebody could tell me when I was feeling connected, I think that would help me to understand. And so you could just imagine, like, that's a really hard way to live, especially when people are telling you this would make your life better. You see your friends and family doing this. Why is this not the same for you? So the overall conclusion here is that there's a paradoxical desire for both closeness and distance. But many times when efforts are made, they feel like the participants in these studies said that that desire for connection and closeness was blocked in some way. And, there's lots of hypotheses. More, I think what we want to take from this is that we want to have an eye out, like, what does this look like for the people in our lives who are trying to connect? And is there a way that we could be even more validating in those moments? These descriptions also addressed repeatedly this idea of just feeling completely separate from people with other disorders, providers not understanding, and family members not understanding. And so I think it's just echoing what we've heard today, partly that the stigma is so built into this disorder that right from the beginning, people feel different. And then when efforts are made to connect that don't land, then that just adds another layer that then reinforces the existing stigma. Cumulatively, this leads to unmet social needs and increased unhappiness. All right, so I hope that this is kind of making sense in how going from BPD through like a skills pathway, either effective or ineffectively, that may or may not lead to loneliness. That if you have BPD, let's say, and your distress tolerance is just not working that day, that can make it harder to stay in a room, stay out with friends, and just have a good time. Feelings of emptiness, one of the diagnostic criteria is not something that I've addressed so far, but this makes it really complicated when you're out. It's closely related to the ability in that moment to feel a sense of connection. And I think it makes it harder also if you're kind of in that moment where you're feeling numb or empty. It makes it harder to connect to the folks around you, but the reciprocal could be true as well. Moments of dysregulation, I think that one is relatively easy to see, that when we are dysregulated, we're just not able to engage in the relationship. And then this is where you hear people say things like, I feel like I'm a burden. Why would you want to be friends with me? And then we're kind of back to loneliness and stigma. And I think one of the really big ones is the fear of rejection and abandonment. And so it's just, depending on the day, so many different layers to push through. I almost picture people like the Kool-Aid man having to like pound through. That's exhausting, right? Sometimes it is easier to just say like, not today, I'm going to stay home. And then I think this is where we land. The one person in the middle, separate from everybody else, what's wrong with me? So stigma, I decided that was covered in other talks, so I'm not redefining anything here. I'm just going to hop to, it's a bidirectional relationship between loneliness and stigma. It is really it is stigmatized by the people who are feeling lonely most often. And when we have that thought, oh, my friend in another city said that she just moved there, she doesn't know anybody. I'm so glad that's not me. I'm never moving again. We have these thoughts, right? Even if we're not actively stigmatizing that other person, we are thinking about the impact on us, or how we would feel in that situation. And it's very rarely positive. Folks who describe themselves as lonely tend to have more negative expectations of the world. They're generally mistrustful. And this all just comes together to put a lot of pressure on social situations that they enter into, making it a little bit harder. It's like the Kool-Aid guy punching through one thing just to be on a more even playing field. There's also the layers, right? If you've got a mental illness plus feeling lonely, plus whatever else you might think about yourself, all of those layers feed that stigma, and then the stigma can come back and feed the loneliness. In 1992, a series of studies was done with college students where they presented to them a hypothetical lonely and non-lonely person and asked them a series of questions, which basically led to this finding that people stigmatize those who are lonely. And that finding has held actually for a very long time until these studies were replicated, I believe, in 2014, and the studies did not actually hold up. And when loneliness was disentangled from social skills and just likability, a lot of that stigma fell away. So I'm taking that to say that for each of us, if you're having a lonely moment and it's hard to go out, well, we fake it till we make it. And that might at least help us get around some of what makes it difficult to put ourselves out there. And over time, it's that self-evaluation, the thoughts of like, why don't people want to be friends with me? I'm not as much fun as this person. I don't know, you can fill in the blank. That really leads us to where we get to stigmatizing ourselves. Like, if only I like wore cute clothes, or if only I liked to go to these clubs, you know, everybody can fill in the blank for themselves and their interests. But it's at the root of it, the same process. And the same process that you see, this looks familiar to you, this is from the Family Connections module. And the stigma and shame cycle, we can put loneliness right in there in the same way you put anything else. And part of what we want to do to respond is exactly the same. And when we get to this, the red circle of judgments, misunderstanding, and invalidation, the first time around, before you get to the stigma on the second time around, we just want to start by actually introducing some accurate expression. Like, I feel lonely and it's really painful. I feel lonely and I'm worried I'm going to feel like this for a really long time. After doing some of this work, when I think of lonely, I'm like, oh my God, 14 cigarettes a day. I got to do something. Whatever it is for you, we want to break this cycle by accurately expressing and hopefully accurately expressing what we're feeling to somebody who can be soothing and validating back, and maybe eventually helping you to problem solve. And so in the same way as everything else, to reduce stigma and shame, we really have to stop hiding, stop withdrawing, and work towards that accurate expression. So what gets in the way? This is from a study done in the UK, where they specifically reached out to people who were lonely in that kind of higher category. And it was interesting how many people discussed that they have reached out in the past, and people were pretty unhelpful. So it made them unlikely to do that again. They had really strong fears of being judged or how people might react. Like, oh, you're not lonely. I see you doing all of these different things, which, as we know, is actually quite invalidating when someone's saying the opposite. Or, oh, well, I get lonely too. I think more what people are asking for is a bit more of a genuine conversation. Then there's the fear of burdening other people and just general shame about being lonely. This might be an obvious point, but the number of times this came up in the set of studies that I've been looking into, and we're doing a series of qualitative interviews with undergraduate students, the amount that comes up, that this feeling of being shameful, is almost still astounding to me. So what are ways for us to cope? We want to just acknowledge what is, right? Radical acceptance. I'm lonely and I didn't have any life events. I'm just lonely. Like, that's just where I am today. Or it makes sense that I feel this way because my really close friend moved, or my close friend has a baby and doesn't have time. And so I see her, but it doesn't feel like it used to. There's so many shades and nuances. It's really important for us to normalize the feeling of loneliness as a shared experience. And I'm making this point also, especially for clinicians, that we want to be asking about this more directly. Even can these shared feelings be a point of connection for people? I mean, we don't want the connection to end there, but even just talking about like, what has it felt like for different people to be lonely, because we know that the experience of it is so varied between people. And then emotion regulation ends up playing an important role. We really can't get away from it ever. But we could think about it even in terms of, can you use some opposite action here? Like you're feeling really lonely. You don't want to connect with other people. You don't want to have to call a friend, but could you go for a walk? What would that be like? Or there's also these ideas around like cognitive emotion regulation, like what are you attributing your loneliness to? And is that actually making you feel better or worse? So what do we do? Like, how do we actually nurture social connection? We want to really think about at the level, like individually, what can we do? Are there things we can do in our relationships? Are there things we can do at the community level? Like maybe you don't want to try to go out there and meet new friends, but there's like a community garden that you might want to get involved with. All you have to do is say hi to somebody and then you can play in dirt. Like, would that work for you? For everybody, it's different, but it doesn't just mean like nurturing these connections doesn't mean that you just reach out to one person and ask them to do something. There's a whole universe of possibilities. I'm going to jump to my last practice. So part of this idea of nurturing relationships is also thinking about us, I think, in a more universal sense. And so as an example of something that I try to ask clients to do, sometimes they're cooperative, sometimes they're not, it depends. This lands with some people and not with others. But I want you guys to just think about, like, how did you come to be here today? And does your mind go to, I got in a car and came here, or I have a family member and I got here? And whichever way you go, if you just take that one step out, what happened? Let's say I'm going to go with the car. I came in a car today. What happened before that, right? Like I woke up in a hotel room and who did I see there? Like who cleaned the room? Who checked me in? And then further back, like, how did I get to the hotel? Like I went down to the garage in my building and the person who works in the garage who likes my dog, so I like him, gave me my car. And before that, where was I? We can also do it, in the other direction of like, how did I come here to be at NEABPD? And who was the family that I was working with that was so impactful? I felt like we have to do something more for families. And then I could take that out in the extreme. This is inspired by Thich Nhat Hanh sentence about the universe in a speck of dust, and how there's so much in each moment for each of us sharing this moment here today, and everybody having a very different perspective on loneliness, this presentation, this day, that can actually become a point of connection for us as well. So just going to take it back to family connections to wrap it up, that our idea is still, right, like talking about our emotions, thinking about mindfulness, whether it's relationship mindfulness or our own mindfulness practice, understanding, sharing some accurate expression, validating, and we're hoping that eventually we get to that point of connection. That is what I have for you.
Thank you so much for this talk. I know loneliness is such a universal experience, and I think a lot of people can relate to what you shared today. We're just going to have time for a couple questions, but we'll have a number of time to do it at the end for the panel discussion. So a couple of people are wondering if there's research on the connection between loneliness and smartphone or social media use, especially in adolescence.
Yes, and it's very mixed. So I did not include here loneliness and social and just digital stuff and loneliness and animals. But the digital stuff is pretty mixed and it's a very unsatisfying answer. So like if you use it to actually increase connection, like if you go onto Facebook and you try to message people or you respond to people's posts versus just doom scrolling, that seems to have a different impact on feelings of loneliness.
And then our last question for now, what is or are the primary emotions that make up the experience of loneliness?
Well, I would suggest that loneliness is a feeling, but I think that there's also a feeling of sadness, of grief, of loss. I think that all of those things kind of mix together. But I think in that moment where you're wishing that a particular person was there or you could do a particular activity that you've liked to do in the past and isn't available to you, that's when we edge a little bit closer to feeling lonely versus missing somebody. Hopefully that's a little bit clarifying.
Thank you so much.